Welcome to another edition of AML Conversations. I'm John Byrne with AML RightSource. And with me today, we have two folks that are going to talk about a number of issues connected to investigations that deal with technology. So really happy to have with us today Justin Cole. I've had the pleasure of working with Justin over the many years that he was the director of the Office of Communication at IRS-CI. Now created his own company. He's the CEO of First Pitch Communications. And my colleague, Joe McNamara. Joe is the Director of Solutions Marketing at AML RightSource. So guys, thank you so much for taking some time today. And Justin, the jumping off point that we talked about before we recorded today and then a couple of weeks ago is you wrote a piece that Joe and I found very fascinating for AML intelligence. And we all, if you're in the AML space, AML intelligence is really a pretty important newsletter to get access to. They do a lot of great global coverage of this challenging issue. But you talked about my characterization, not yours necessarily, but the use of communications in investigation, dealing with AML and financial crime prevention. What I found interesting about it, besides the theme, is you think we're in a new paradigm now. And so I want to sort of open it up and let you discuss where you think we are today. And I have obviously some follow-up questions, but the paradigm, and again, somebody like yourself who had extensive experience with case agents, your IRS-CI chiefs, all the great work that IRS has been doing over the years with financial crime. So we got to figure out new tools going forward because the criminals haven't stopped getting ahead of us. So talk about that paradigm shift.
Well, thanks very much for having me, first of all, John. Pleasure to be with both of you guys. I guess what I would describe the paradigm shift is it's not just an all communication as everything that you do involves communication. Really, communication needs to have access to every aspect of your organization. One of the things that I've always found beneficial, and I've been extremely fortunate in 25 plus years in government, whether it's the military and law enforcement, I had access as the most junior person in the room to all of the most senior leaders making the decisions, and they listened to the communicators. I've always been told that a leader when he travels, should travel with his comms person and his lawyer. And they took that seriously. They listened to the advice that we had. But what I found in the last 25 years was it wasn't just a matter of how is comms going to be affected by what we're doing, but how can comms affect what we're doing? And that's really the shift. Communication now is a part of the process. It's a part of the planning. I can't tell you the number of meetings I've sat in where case agents did a pre-op brief, getting ready to go do something that was very serious, very dangerous. We knew what their intentions were. And then you watch how it plays out on the media or to other folks who are involved in that operation, and the unintended consequences because they weren't taking on board the role that communication played. And so we have absolutely, at least in IRS-CI, in the military, back when I was at Homeland Security, started incorporating communication, whether it was another vehicle, it was a weapon, it was something that was for information. There's so many different roles that communication can play, but if you're not aware of them as a leader, then you're really missing a large tool at your disposal.
What's the part of, you say traveling with a lawyer makes a ton of sense. We certainly have seen that issue get raised currently in terms of JAG officers in the military, but legal communication. So in our AML field, obviously we have the users of the information. So the users of SAR data by the federal government, state government, those folks, the filers, which are the financial institutions. And so you got to try to figure out how you use that information to get that information in front of law enforcement. I won't say what's the limits, but what are the concerns when you talk about the boundaries, as you do in the article, of legal communication? Because you got to play by the rules. At least we hope that's still the case, right?
Yeah.
And so, but you have to figure out, how do we navigate the need to be both proactive and all that? So give us your sense of legal communication.
Well, I think you have to decide. You always start with your endpoint in mind, right? So if the goal of your communication is to change a behavior, you have a completely different strategy than if the goal was to get someone to be prosecuted and put in jail, right? If that's the goal, if putting bad guys in jail is the goal, then you have to be very careful and with your communication. And I'm not suggesting that other types of communication, you don't have to follow the law, but I'm just suggesting that you don't say or do things that a good defense attorney would see as affecting the investigation in some way. You also have to be careful not to tip off the perpetrator, the bad guy that you're going after. In many cases, we get to a certain point of an investigation, and I've always found this interesting. The interest, the media interest, the public interest in a case, which could take two years from start to finish, is never as high as it is at the very beginning. And it's almost like a slope, and it just keeps going down the longer that an investigation is going on. When you have an indictment, when you have an arrest and then an indictment, that media interest is incredibly high. And as you go through all the different court proceedings, and then you get to a sentencing, and people want to get out there and say, look what we did. After 2 years, people have heard it. They're not even hearing any new information. So what law enforcement tends to do, knowing this, they get out there at an arrest or an indictment, and they like to hold a press conference. But you're saying things about someone who has not been convicted of anything yet. So you have to be very careful. And every fourth word is allegedly and things like that. So that's important. You have to do things to allow the case to continue to progress. And you might want to stand up there and pound your chest. You might want to tell everybody what you've accomplished. But at the end of the day, that might only be the very beginning of the case. You might have co-conspirators. You might have 80% more types of crimes that person has perpetrated that you haven't uncovered. But now that you've got this indictment in place, you may have superseding indictments. So you have to be careful. You don't want to tip off that you know certain things. You want to continue to allow the investigation to take this course. If you're not trying to do that, what I suggested at the beginning, if you're trying to warn people, for instance, a lot of these scams, you're not interested in bringing someone and tipping off that you know what their tactics, techniques, procedures, all of their different ways that they're trying to communicate with you. A lot of times you don't want to let the bad guys know that you know that about them so that they don't too quickly change their tactics, right? But if you're trying to protect people, if that is the purpose of your communication, you want to get it out there as soon as possible, change that behavior, save as many people as much money as possible. So you really got to start with the end point in mind, I think, John.
Joe, the use of data, the use of this information for our analysts at RightSource, and obviously our clients, analysts, and financial institutions, it becomes important to sort of separate the wheat from the chaff, if you will. And while you have to recognize the legal, I won't call them restrictions, but the legal process as Justin's laid out, you also have to verify the data, right? Verify the information, whether it's artificial intelligence, the big debate going on now, or just in general looking at adverse media. What are some of the things, given your background and certainly what we do at RightSource, working with our clients, we also have to train them on using information correctly, to not, my words, not jump to conclusions. You know, you certainly can have situations where maybe someone in law enforcement does hold those press conferences that Justin's talked about, and they have information, but it's based on a grand jury indictment, which we know are in some cases are pretty simple to get in place. But we're analysts, so we have to sort of decide how valid is this information for our client or us to make a decision. So what are some of the things from a training standpoint that you would recommend?
I think it's a great question. It's complex in nature. I think there's a couple things, John, that jump out. The first is the somewhat simple answer of that's why adverse media monitoring exists today, right? Like, to your point, and certainly, Justin, you kind of have hit on it too. The quality of data has never been more suspect than it is today. As much as we'd like to believe that, technology is moving at a breakneck pace, which arguably it is, depending on the prism you look through, there's never been a higher need or a higher value put on common sense and put on validations. Meaning, John, to your point too, when I think about what our analysts are asked to do on a day-to-day basis, it's not simply go out and aggregate as much data and as much information and media as possible, but it's also you need to be comprehensive in terms of how you're reviewing all of this data that's flowing in. In terms of what I see more from even my day to day, a lot of it has to do with how credible is this stuff that's being delivered to me. And The example I've given in the past is essentially, if you've got somebody if you would imagine AI or any kind of communication process is put in place, if you don't have somebody that's been there and done that before, it's very difficult to expect that if you place them at the end of that assembly line, that is the LLM or kind of that communications shortcut, that you're going to get somebody that fully understands what they're looking at. And that creates a huge issue from a credibility perspective, from, a truth perspective, but then also just overall from, is this credible enough to where we're going to be able to utilize this down the road? And I think a lot of the same things that apply to, the rigors that we hold ourselves to on the thought leadership side, the SME side, certainly play into the larger conversations that are happening today, right? Around, how do you actually toe that line of communication without necessarily crossing it, depending on where you stand.
Can I come in on that point too?
Justin mentioned, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I just think what you just said is such a important thing, Joe, and it's the quality of the data. But I think a lot of it has to do with the perspective that you come to that conversation with and the role that you play as well, right? So, for instance, I just moderated a panel in Europe a few months ago, and the folks who were coming to, we're talking about SARS. So if you're a law enforcement person, they were from different countries, and to a person, they all said, my goodness, SARS are so important to our investigations, but they're written so poorly. And we need them to be written better. They need to include these things. And then you listened to people from FIUs or from banks, and to a person, they all said, boy, it would be great if we knew what law enforcement wanted and we could provide you. We're just writing what we think that is important to us. But until you get those two folks together to communicate about what it is they need and how best to serve it, you're just all throwing darts in the dark, and no wonder they don't connect.
Yeah, we could spend a lot of time talking about the SAR narrative process, and obviously there's been some counters to that, saying that sometimes there's too much information that your former colleagues at IRS simply want, shorter bullet points. So there's a whole thing about that. Better communication, I think, is the key. The thing I was starting to reference to you is you mentioned in your piece the importance of, spotlighting, putting things out in the open, because obviously criminals benefit from anonymity. And one of the things you reference is some of the great work that investigative journalists have done, whether it's the FinCEN papers or Panama Paradise papers. Those things, when they were disclosed, changed policy. They were reaction to public outcry on, what was happening around the world in terms of the movement of illicit funds. So that becomes a part of this too. And it goes back to your original point that you want to be open about this. If somebody is doing a press conference, appropriate legal disclaimers that this is an arrest, this is not a conviction, but here's the facts that we have discovered thus far that we plan to prove in court. So talk about the value, besides what I mentioned, the value proposition of communication from the media. So we'll start with investigative journalism, which my prejudice is I think they do an excellent job. I'm not as supportive of some of other media. I don't think necessarily, it depends. It depends on, where you're getting your information from. And I think there's some struggles there for a variety of reasons. But it seems to me that investigative journalists, who we still need, and there's a couple of organizations we've talked to, the Office of Crime and Corruption Reporting Project is one, ICIJ is another, and I'm sure, Justin, you've dealt with many. Talk about the probably more important today, given your view about spotlighting on criminal activity, more important today than before, the need for investigative journalists and using their information as we communicate, whether it's law enforcement communicating with one another or private public communication.
Boy, there's so much to say about that topic that you just laid out. I think I would sum it up in kind of a hand in glove kind of relationship, that the importance of what investigative journalists is and what they do is, it cannot be understated. It is, or cannot be overstated. I'm sorry. It is incredible. They have access to talking to people. They have contacts. I can't tell you a number of times a journalist has called me and said, hey, I'm hearing this is what's about to happen. And I go to my boss and I say, I just got a call from a journalist and they said this. And they said, How do they know? I don't even know that yet. I mean, they know things about our own organizations a lot of times because of their contacts. I think sometimes journalists, I guess if they have desire to promote their name or their outlet or get a big win or get a headline and then move on to another outlet, I've seen instances where they might write something that is not necessarily as thoroughly fact-checked or researched, and it's too quick to get to the headline, right? In fact, a lot of times journalists don't even write the headlines anymore. It's their editors. They're trying to get clicks or sell things. But those guys who do the real hard work, the investigative folks, who have the reputation, who do the work, sometimes the only antidote for corruption is a good journalist. It's not law enforcement. But when the two can work together, it's absolutely incredible. Law enforcement doesn't have access to some of the procedures and tactics and people just based on the way that they have to go about their business. And I'm not suggesting, this is a very dangerous place to be ethically, to suggest that law enforcement work with journalists to skirt around different rules and regulations and laws. But if a journalist has a relationship with someone and trusts that person in a government agency, in a law enforcement agency or something, and they can call and say, here's a story I'm working on. This is what I'm starting to write. What am I missing? And then the person in government, as I've done many times, always within the law, obviously, you say, well, this is a really interesting topic and there's so many players and here's some of the pieces that you might be missing, because what you don't want is to allow a journalist to knowingly publish something that is missing some large piece of that puzzle that could promote something incredibly negative or have some dire consequences. You want them to at least know, what the whole story is. And then they'll decide when it's time to go to publish. You don't get to control what they do. But things like the Panama Papers, guys, I mean, even FIFA, a huge topic with the World Cup coming next year. I mean, there was a FIFA corruption scandal about 10 years ago, I guess, at this point. And you might say FIFA corruption scandal 10 years ago. Every year for the last, however many years FIFA has been in existence, there's been corruption. But people have been writing about it. And sometimes it goes to where maybe a law enforcement investigation can turn the tide in some different ways that organization operates. And other times you need it to be something like the Panama Papers, where journalists go about and push things out. And then you have, like you said, it's a watershed moment for many folks where they have this crisis, because at one point they want all that data and they want to use it to help further investigations and help root out corruption and things like that. But how was it obtained? Was it obtained legally? How can we use this? And you have all these different, tanked organizations that go through the data. It's a whole interesting concept, but in different times throughout history, there have been moments where it's been the journalists, there have been moments where it's been law enforcement that have made the day. And I think they have to be working not necessarily together, but with knowledge of each other.
Joe, we talked a bit about ethics. Justin's referenced that. We could do a whole webinar on the use of artificial intelligence and the ethical, not constraints, guardrails that should be around it. But I want to sort of phrase it this way. So given what Justin said, that sometimes you can have journalists that craft stories that are incomplete. And I also have had many years of experience working with the media. And to Justin's point, many, many times the story doesn't look anything like the headline at all. So then you get a misconception, especially people that have very short attention spans. They look at the headline that's saying something was a fraud or was not a fraud, and they don't read the whole piece. So given that, if an analyst is trying to figure out, maybe they're working with a client to decide whether an alert rises to a level of a SAR or some red flag, do you continue the investigation? And they're decided, I'm going to use artificial intelligence as the tool to do that. So in some instances, I've talked to some banks, by the way, that have started to tell their staffs, stop writing narratives with using AI solely. They say, don't do that. And they've noticed right away that some of the staffs are doing that, saying, if you're going to use AI as you're going to use something to like improve grammar or whatever, you need to put your own two cents into it, lack of a better analogy. But in any event, what are the ethical issues that you see using artificial intelligence as a tool to either bolster an investigation or further an investigation? And what are some of the things I know we're in relative infancy of this, but what are some of the things you're seeing, and what are some of the danger signs of over reliance?
Question, and for starters, I think the one thing I would call out, although it's a much larger mountain to climb, is there should be an ongoing call for ethics when it comes to overall communications. To your point, it cannot simply justify a false narrative simply because you expect to get more clicks that way. Unfortunately, in today's world, that's pretty much what we're inundated with. But I'd be remiss if I didn't at least call it out and say, for those of you that are in control and able to somehow influence a message, that should be kind of 101, a burden of due diligence. To your larger question, though, John, in terms of utilization of AI, right? Like, I wholeheartedly agree. Like, nobody should be 100% reliant on AI from start to finish. It's just, number one, it's, to your point, it's in its infancy. It's just not there yet. But more importantly, I'm going to use a somewhat probably terrible simile or metaphor here. When somebody says, I built this house, you didn't technically build this house, right? You used your tools in order to construct something. In the same breath, or kind of the same notion, when I look at AI, it's a tool. It's a tool amongst many tools that you should have as a communications professional, as somebody that again can and should in some cases impact the narrative. But simply relying on, in my opinion, what is still a very black box tool in order to do your thinking and do your work for you is really not the way to approach utilizing AI. Now, Justin, I'd welcome your thoughts on this too. But when I work with our team, the number one thing that I tell them is, look, AI is a tool, and you should be able to use that tool to help augment and supplement what you're doing. However, at the end of the day, it's your name that goes out on this. And so, it needs to represent and it needs to reflect, the knowledge and certainly the work and due diligence that goes into what we do on a day-to-day basis. Obviously, very different than a lot of the things that you worked on over the course of the last few decades. But I still think that there's an obligation and responsibility that holds true regardless of where you sit when you utilize a tool like this.
Yeah, it's scary. It's exciting. Everything is good if you use it for good. It can be bad very quickly, right? And it's the definition, I think, is really important too, and it's changed for over the number of years. I think what we now refer to as just straight data analytics used to be basically AI. It was feeding a lot of things into a machine that was able to draw conclusions and patterns and see things that we weren't able to as humans based on either volume or predictions or past experiences. And I think when you're talking about generative AI and when you're talking about creating things, that's where you get a little bit scary and you bring in those ethical conversations. But in reality, it's a partner. But when you start creating things, that's where communications, I think, a little bit different than everything else, because at the heart of it, we all consume media and communication in different ways, but kind of the same. We put information in stories. That's how we remember things. If you were to tell someone something through telling them a story, they'll remember that as opposed to just telling them facts. And AI can help you generate those stories, but if it's not going to reach your audience in the way that they're used to getting that information, and again, that's something that as the owner of that information, of that audience, how they feel. Give you a bunch of solutions, but your personal experiences may be more valuable than some kind of predictive machine. Maybe you're reaching someone who still gets their news, 1.5 million people still watch nightly news if they're over 55 or so, and so maybe that's how they want to get their news, from someone they watched growing up. Maybe if you're watching the morning show on Apple TV and you're having like this personalization of your news, you can have someone that you know and respect now speak your language and tell you things, and now you're going to believe it. And that gets into a whole nother conversation about what makes you believe things. And if someone says something that's not true over and over again and you respect that person, you're believing that non-truth as well. So AI can get into so many different levels of whether you believe what they're saying or not. But I think the most successful communication campaigns still have to involve that human element, because there's no replacing that people have with their audiences, I suppose.
Justin, let me ask you this, and we're going to get you guys out of here on a couple final follow-up final questions. One is, what's a good from your perspective, you talked about strategic communication, whether it's, look, in a press conference you referenced earlier, where you're trying to tell the public, hey, we got somebody. Yes, it's just an arrest, but here's the series of things that network did. And that's supposed to send a message to the public that this particular group that committed elder abuse or human trafficking or whatever, and you give them the examples from that. So that's a strategic communication. That's both the press conference about the arrest, but you're also giving information to the public, hopefully to maybe help you get additional evidence and or better understand what your law enforcement partners were able to stop, or how the network worked. What would you recommend are places to get information like that? So, and I'll start you off. You could have certainly press releases from your former agencies and other law enforcement, or guidance documents, that kind of stuff. Obviously, there's newspaper reporting. The LinkedIn that we're all on seems to provide more information for our world than I've ever seen before. There's a lot of people that will look at some of these guidance documents and reports and summarize them, all that good stuff. So if you're hiring me, or I'm hiring you, and I say, what should my company be looking at on a regular basis? Give us some recommendations that you have.
Boy, put me on the spot there. I think it goes back to what's your goal. There's so many different examples. And if communication is to be used as a deterrence, then you need to make sure all of those people see themselves in what the actions are that you're taking. There's no crime that is going to be eradicated with any amount of volume of law enforcement. And so there has to be some deterrence that comes from, so people need to see what you're doing. There's some great examples. One of the organizations I used to lead comms for was the J5, Joint Chiefs of Global Tax Enforcement, and they would hold different events, do these cyber challenges, and then they would put out documents. They would come away from a 3-day event with hundreds of leads, dozens of cases that would lead to some of the largest seizures in the history of government. And then they would publish red flag indicators so people can see where we got all this information from and how other entities around the globe could say, look what they did. And look, these are the red flags that they used to find that information. And now we can replicate that as well. There's so many examples of that. The UK did a great job. Their tax authority,
Yeah.
and again, these are two tax examples, but they had an ad campaign on the tube, and there were just QR codes when they were trying to increase the amount of people that were coming in from what is the equivalent of like their Swiss bank program or something. But people they found when they're going to places of business would just click on the QR code, and then they could track and say, look at the increase in the amount of people we had come into this campaign, and we could say, oh, but they all came in through this tube campaign that we did. So you're able to actually value the communication in that sense. So, and those are a few examples, red flags. But then just all handshakes, glad handing people, going to conferences and listening to people. I can't tell you the number of times I would be with our chief, and we would go and speak at an event. And it's not other leaders like that person, like the chief was, but it was practitioners, it was casino operators, it was bankers, who were filling out the SARS. And you talk about what's important, and then you walk off the stage, and the line of people waiting to talk to the chief and just say, thank you so much. Here's my card. I have some things that I really need to talk to someone in your organization about. And that's another really, really good way of getting leads as an agency, I suppose, as well.
Joe, same question for you, but I'll premise it this way. You're not, I don't mean this pejoratively, you're not an AML expert. You've been at AML RightSource, and obviously you learn quite a bit. So from somebody like yourself, who has an extensive background in public relations, marketing, all those issues, the importance of content, not necessarily exactly what do you look at every day, but if somebody says to you, hey, look, I want to be aware of a lot of different issues. I want to understand financial crime. I want to understand economic, all that kind of stuff. And there's only so much you can read or listen to in a day. How would you start them off?
Oh man, similar answer, right? Way to put me on the spot, Sean. I think it kind of comes down to two things, and I'll speak from my experience. I'm not sure I could spell AML when I walk through the door at AML RightSource, but aside from the typical, news sources between FinCEN and FATF and OFAC and all of these agencies that are essentially, putting out, ongoing information, I'd highly encourage folks that are looking to just better understand the space, to find folks that have been there. And I was fortunate enough, I got a chance to walk into an organization with a lot of folks that had spent decades of their lives, including you, to this pursuit of, better justice and just better, compliance. And to be able to raise your hand, I think is the other key. It's okay, right? After I learned how to spell AML, then came all the other acronyms. And so with that, there's a lot of hand raising at the start, but I still find myself, almost daily kind of stopping and asking, what does this mean, or how does this impact my ongoing knowledge or underlying knowledge of the space? And I think you and Elliot can probably attest to it most. Like, I've gotten to the point where I'll fire off a question, hey, why is this important? Or am I reading this the right way? And so for anybody that's obviously not within the bounds of AML RightSource, I just encourage you, find your peers, find your colleagues, find folks that are operating. They may not necessarily be in the exact same space, right? Like, I'm not sure that marketing is necessarily your background fully, but find those tangential ties and be able to, really relate. And Justin, back to your point, like, handshakes go so far, right? Like, it's an opportunity where, as long as you can speak a common language with somebody, and I don't mean that necessarily through, a global language perspective, but more so from, I understand where you're coming from. I understand your challenges. I think there's a lot of information to be gleaned from that.
Justin and Joe, one more final question. I'll start with you, Justin. What do you see as the biggest challenge in 2026 and beyond for all of us in the financial crime prevention space or its adjacency in terms of communication? What's the biggest challenge?
Trust, politics. I think, without getting into too much detail, I think anytime you have an administration change, you get used to new policies and procedures. And right now, most of the government agencies are still shut down. You can't get them to talk about what they're doing. I think when that happens, you lose public trust in those institutions. I think the more dialogue that there is between law enforcement and government agencies and the public, so they see how they operate, why they're doing what they're doing, they don't just clam up, that breeds trust. That breeds folks who want to help, because nobody wants to live in a crime-ridden area. They want to do the right thing, but you have to have trust in your agencies. And so I think the more that they allow communication to exist, I think that the better things will be.
Joe, biggest challenge?
I think biggest challenge from where I sit is, in part, it's attention, right? We've never been more bombarded when it comes to overall data in every facet of our lives. It's harder and harder, it seems, to kind of garner the attention of folks, and especially, in a space like this, that can be very troublesome. And so I think the challenge to us, to our team, is essentially figuring out, how do we continue to relate to our audience and make sure that we're meeting them where they are, instead of just relying on where they used to come, right? And I think a lot of that comes back to relationships. A lot of that comes back to taking the time and actually sitting down to think about your audience and how do you put them at the center of just about everything that you do.
Justin Coles with First Pitch Communication. We will link to the article that we referenced as well as to his website. Joe McNamara works with us, AML RightSource. Gentlemen, thank you so much for shedding some insight in this space, and I'm sure we'll be back again as we continue to try to figure all this out. So thanks so much.
Thanks, John.